There is a man, a certain man. What is his name? His name is Charlie Kane. Hello and welcome back to this damn idealistic crusade. There is a man, a very certain man who we just can't help but talk about till the beyond the end of time. That man, of course, is Charlie Kane, and of course also Orson Welles. So talking about Citizen Kane is something that I find myself doing all the time and something I can't stop doing or can't stop thinking about. And with the recent Criterion release on both 4K UHD and Blu-ray from new restoration work, I felt it was a good idea to go back into the home video history of Citizen Kane, which is actually far more convoluted than I think most people realize or would even think of, seeing as the film was is so known for being the key crown jewel in the RKO library, and the RKO library being under the banner of Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers handling all of the modern releases except for the Criterion loan out just now. Of course, this goes all the way back to the Turner library acquisition, and then of course Turner had already acquired RKO, so Turner sort of metamorphosed into Warner Home Video, and we always link them in our heads together. But there is quite a varied history with a lot of historic and important home video milestones, most particularly the original Criterion Laserdisc release of Spine Number 1 in 1984. But in digging around, I found even things that I was not aware of. So this is not a comprehensive video history. I tried to make it as comprehensive as possible, but I'm primarily just talking about the US video releases, the main ones that then spawned other video masters, and there is always some variance in other countries, so I will talk a little bit about some other foreign editions. But since the early days of Kane, particularly the 1980s on home video in the VHS and Beta realm, it is varied to such a degree in between of distributors and labels that I found some tapes and various releases that I was unaware of, some that only differ by the cover art design, or some that only differ by the distributor, but the tape and the label is the same. And there is some little bit of information that I couldn't exactly verify, so unfortunately it's not as fully 100% complete as I would like it to be, but this was the best I could come up with in my own particular research. And I've always loved doing home video histories, and I've done a number on this channel before, but this one I knew was really special because there are specific things about the older releases that are still important today that are missing from the modern Criterion release. And in particular, there are particular releases with superior audio to any other known release, even including the improved but still not perfect audio on the Criterion Blu-ray and UHD combo release. So that's what got me started about thinking of Citizen Kane home video releases again, and got me digging around and looking at other copies that I had just sort of skimmed over before. And so I will admit I have acquired a couple more copies just to check their transfer stats and look at the audio that's included on them. And also I find it fascinating looking at the different packaging and the restoration work and the photochemical days and then the earlier days of video. So that's why I wanted to put this together. So I did have to make quite a bit of notes, so you'll see me glancing down at some notes I made, and that way I had everything laid out in a timeline, because although I could probably rattle off most of this to somebody if they asked me on the street, and then they'd run away screaming like I was a crazy person because, I carry around Citizen Kane video factoids in my head. I wanted to make sure I had everything laid out in order. So that's why you'll see me glancing down to my couple pages of notes. Now, very surprisingly, there's a nice little write-up on the film's Wikipedia page about its preservation status. And it does go into some nice details. Unfortunately, not all of it is accredited, and I couldn't also find the particular video editions it alludes to as the very first video editions in the late 70s, early 80s. So you will have to take that with a little grain of salt, because again, I couldn't find any indication of some physical releases that exactly correspond to these. So it is very possible these do exist. I just couldn't find any photos or any evidence or even auction listings that might have them. So those are always your best bet if you're looking for older home video releases, trying to put your own home video history together of a particular title. because if you just go off of what people say in forums or on Wikipedia, it's not always correct, or they may repeat something that they heard from somebody else who maybe got the year of release wrong. So you always do have to try and go back to make sure you can find physical evidence that those releases actually do exist. But again, it was very surprising. There is a little home video section on the film's Wikipedia page, because that rarely happens. It's usually just a generic mention of some of the main VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, or Blu-ray release dates, and that's it. What is important to note is that in the lead up to the Criterion release, it was put out on Twitter by Nicholas Falacci. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. And this has been spread over different forums, and it's on the Wikipedia page as well. But he talks about when he was working in a film lab during the lead up to the 50th anniversary reissue campaign for 1992, when people from Turner and RKO and everybody were trying to scramble to put together a clean print source to then use for the new Video Masters and then do a limited theatrical release, that they were panicking. And it essentially came down to the fact that it was sort of told to him by somebody else why they were panicking, and a very hush-hush, keep it under the carpet, that the original negative for Citizen Kane, which is no longer in existence and is supposed to have been lost in a vault fire sometime in the 1970s, that was not actually the case. And due to, if this is true, one of the worst and most painful cases of mismanagement ever, that the original negative for Citizen Kane was mistakenly sent to a silver reclamation plant and destroyed for the silver content inside the nitrate film stock. And that's why there's no negative, and that's why the 50th anniversary version and all successive versions were compiled from the best surviving fine-grain protection elements. Whether this is true or not, nobody knows, but it seems quite valid, and from the source that it comes from and the dates that line up with the 50th anniversary campaign. And when you look at the 50th anniversary release on VHS or Laserdisc, and the version that continued to be in release and on broadcast, it does have all this baked in damage. It has scratches right in the iconic opening on Xanadu, and you're like, why is it so bad off for, supposedly being restored? And that would explain that too, that it was literally cobbled together hurriedly from the best things they could find. But again, it's absolutely heartbreaking to think, and of course you can't miss the irony of it being like the final flames at the end at Xanadu when everything's being burned. And of course, it sort of fits in with the film's underdog status, always being the underdog. And most ironic of all, the RKO was offered the entire production cost by Louis B. Mayer, representing other studios, to buy the film and burn the negative in terms of trying to appease William Randolph Hearst, who was then going to possibly attack the entirety of the film industry. So there's quite a bit of irony there, and I hate to think that that's what happened, but it is very possible. But in any case, the original negative no longer exists, so every version is coming from several generations away, at least one or two generations away, because you're not dealing with original negative, which is one of the issues that still abounds in the Criterion release. So that's important to note, and it was only recently in the past year that story came out, so you'll see that repeated sometimes. Now, the RKO film library was sold during the television era of the 1950s, as were most film libraries, and this meant it was held under a variety of different groups and sort of passed around. The classic film libraries of all the major studios were not properly valued at what they were, so a lot were sold at a pittance in terms of their television rights, or it was more quick cash for studios who needed it, and eventually they started valuing their packages more and more and more, but it took a little while, and RKO did not get the same type of deal that, say, Warner Brothers or MGM would have. This continued and basically happened all over again in the early days of home video, where, again, you had people getting home video libraries for nothing. Studios didn't even think it was important to have their own home video labels. Eventually they caught on, but they had to wait for those contracts to expire or negotiate new ones, which is why you saw so many films from different studios being released on tiny labels, or labels that were not as spiffy as what a studio label would become. Or you had the United Artists Library, for example, appear on a number of different labels, and it was only these early forerunners in the home video realm that were taking advantage of this, whether it was Magnetic Video or Vidamerica, for example. Then eventually 20th Century Fox stepped in and came up with their own video label, and eventually the other studios started to follow suit. But Citizen Kane basically got passed around a lot, and if you look at a lot of the older or original video releases, a lot of them look almost like the cheap knockoff public domain tapes where you would see all these various labels doing stuff like that, and a lot of these labels were labels that released tapes like that of films in the public domain, but they also just happened to have the rights to Citizen Kane, and a lot of these were released in different packages over the years. When official studio releases came out, they still somehow had a license or were able to finagle a way to keep releasing copies of Citizen Kane, even though they were just using whatever prints were on hand, and it also was not up to the level of what would be on the official studio releases as well. Now, I should also mention the colorization issue. Ted Turner was famous, or infamous, I should say, for wanting to colorize classic black and white films that he had purchased the rights to. And colorization was in its infancy then and was a garish, god-awful nightmare. Thankfully, it really was stopped by the various Senate hearings over the issue, and many people fought against the colorization idea, and it was eventually, settled to a point where it was deemed, destructive to the original work, which it is, and Turner stopped this practice, but certain films were released in colorized versions in official Turner releases, and those made it to VHS tape. They're now collector's items, and they were thankfully never reissued again. They did not make it to Laserdisc, and of course, Turner wanted to colorize Citizen Kane, it being one of the most important, most well-known titles he had access to. Wells himself, before his death, actually spoke out against this, and the famous quote, to the effect of "Keep Turner and his goddamn crayons away from my movie." It is, a great quote with good reason. The thing is, though, there was a portion of the film that was actually colorized ostensibly as a test. It seems they did a reel or two at the end, and you can actually see a clip from that. They show it, for an example, in the great BBC documentary that was made in the early 1990s that is included on the Criterion release. It is the best documentary to date about Citizen Kane, even though it is quite old and only in standard definition. But one of the most fascinating parts of that is they show you a tiny clip of that colorized reel to give you an idea of the monstrosity that it was going to be. And thankfully that's as much as they ever did, and it was shelved, and if anything had to be destroyed and burned, why couldn't it have been the colorization footage? So anyway, that's an important note about that, and the fact that it actually was done, and had it not been for the legal battles and Turner, thank God, throwing in the towel, there could have been a colorized VHS tape release of Citizen Kane, just as what happened to King Kong, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and The Maltese Falcon, among many, many, many others that will just break your heart. They're such an atrocity. So to move on to my sort of timeline video release history of Citizen Kane, again, I had to write all this down, so that's why you'll see me glancing at my notes. I did also find a release under the King of Video label, which was released in a clamshell case on VHS tape. I don't know the origin of it, and I was not able to ascertain the actual year of manufacture. It is possible this is an early 80s release. It does look like an early tape release, and also in the early days of home video, people weren't buying tapes, they were renting tapes, and most tapes were not available of feature films to purchase. You could only rent them. It took some time for the idea of actually being able to purchase major studio tapes for home use as opposed to just renting them. So these smaller releases would actually be sold to consumers, but it was not a commonly accepted practice, and it wasn't something everybody was doing quite yet at the time. So again, this is the very early days of home video, where it's very difficult to sort of ascertain what release came where. Sometimes they would be reissued over a couple years, maybe with slight changes in the cover, but there's no copyright date on the packaging, so you just don't know what year it comes from and the years of manufacturing range. In turning to the video releases, we do indeed have the first known video release of Citizen Kane, and the Wikipedia entry is correct. I did finally find the very first original Nostalgia Merchant release, which is in a custom slip sleeve for both the VHS and Beta editions. Now, there is no copyright information dates printed on these releases, but from other research I did, from the simultaneous releases they did also in '78 of other RKO classics, especially King Kong, which also had the exact same cover art designs with this multitude of RKO imagery and stars. So this is the original 1978 release. What I have pictured here is the beta tape. It was apparently released in both VHS and Betamax. I don't know if they were exactly at the same time. My guess is that they were, or around the same time, but for all intents and purposes, this is the very first official consumer home video release of Citizen Kane on any format, and the first of Nostalgia Merchant's mini releases that would continue throughout the rest of the decade and the rest of the 1980s. They would be one of two primary labels to keep releasing these lesser transfers of Kane. These are primarily being based on whatever they could get their hands on. I don't know if technically, because I haven't been able to see it, but I have seen older versions of Kane and other RKO films and Kong, and seen how crappy they looked because of the transfers of the time and what they were having to use. So this is primarily going to be some sort of print source, possibly even a television print that could have been edited for time. So it just depends. But for all intents and purposes, this is the very first home video release, and this is what you would have been able to buy in 1978 and throughout the early 1980s when it was still being sold. If you wanted Citizen Kane in the home and you somehow had a VCR or a Betamax player, this is what you would be getting. And again, it is just a fascinating artifact of its time. And this is before the RKO library was fully exploited by its studio owner. So it would take a number of years before Citizen Kane got an official studio release. That really wouldn't actually happen until 1985, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But it's just amazing this exists, and it does prove that Wikipedia article was correct, or at least that section of the Wikipedia article. And these would also still be analog only because this predates the usage of hi-fi audio. A 1980 release by the Nostalgia Merchant label. This is a beta tape release, so this would have been for Betamax players. I assume there was also a VHS release around the same time. I just couldn't find any physical evidence of that existing. So with a lot of these, there is a sort of simultaneous release between VHS and Beta of the same master and by the same label with almost identical packaging. So and they would reissue these from time to time. So with a lot of these, there will be semi-concurrent VHS and Beta versions. They didn't always come out in the same year, but they were around the same time period for each of the competing formats. Then in 1980, there was another beta release by Vidamerica, who did a variety of Citizen Kane releases, and this just happens to be the first one that I'm aware of that they did, and released it on Betamax as well. It is possible that they also released a VHS tape in 1980. I just didn't find any evidence of that, but they did do a number of tapes shortly thereafter. All of these older releases that were not done by the official, in terms of being like an official studio release, it's very likely they used a variety of different print sources. I don't know if it was 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, or wherever they got their hands on a version of the film. It very much seems like it would be what you would get in the early days of home video, and also what most of the public domain films in terms of their video releases were getting at this point and throughout the entirety of home video up to and including the present day. So these sources are going to vary wildly. The transfers are going to vary wildly. There's no hi-fi audio on these because they are such early tape releases, and I would assume the quality leaves a lot to be desired. I've only seen one older tape of Kane before, and it was not in the best condition, but I remember the transfer was really quite poor. But again, that was a very long time ago, and I would be curious to see some of the qualities of these older releases. And yes, there is some fun to seeing a video release this old and it being a direct print transfer, and sometimes they can be really good, but the vast majority of the time they are quite poor, and they could also be using versions of the film or prints that had damage or were incomplete, as a number of television airings of Citizen Kane were actually heavily edited down to fit different time slots. So that's another problem you have to deal with when looking at the oldest of video releases. The 1981 RCA Selectavision CED release, with the, as usual of CED, really nice custom art based around the center circle design. It's got this really bold red cover. For a CED, again, CEDs usually have really nice custom artwork, and it looks very nice. It's a particularly interesting design aesthetic, but the CED format itself is so full of issues and quirks, and is just about the most notorious home video format for having playback issues and being a real pain to deal with. However, when you get it working right, I've never actually had the chance to use a working CED player myself, because again, a working CED player, just finding one, let alone being able to use it and it's still working throughout a whole feature or two, is very slim, especially today in 2022. But when it works, and when the stylus tracks the disc properly, because it's a disc with a lubrication inside of the plastic caddy, and you have to flip it over halfway through, it would be very interesting to see what the transfer itself looks like. I assume it would be very similar to the early VHS tape releases, but it is interesting to note that Kane actually did come to the CED format. Then next, I was able to locate a 1982 release, this by the Vidamerica label, which did a variety of different films and animated features and cartoons throughout the 80s and 90s. They actually did have a pretty decent market share in terms of their section of the field, but it is sort of weird when you see labels like Vidamerica getting giant titles, and of course Citizen Kane. This release seems pretty bare bones. It does not have hi-fi audio, since it is an early VHS tape. Most of these will be analog sound only, and again, I can only assume they just got a print source like Nostalgia Merchant and others would have, and just transferred that, so it pretty much is what it is. In 1983, Vidamerica did another beta release with an updated cover. Again, my guess would be that this was merely a repackaging of their previous Betamax release, and that seems to be the case with a lot of these tape releases from Nostalgia Merchant and Vidamerica. It's just that they updated their cover design, or the distributor would change, and they would slightly tweak the packaging and reissue the same tape again. So again, without being able to see these, this is just my educated guess, but it very much seems like they just kept updating the packaging over and over. Next, we come to the big one, which is the 1984 release of Criterion Spine Number 1, their very first Laserdisc release of Citizen Kane, which was their first Laserdisc release, period. It was released pretty much concurrently with Spine Number 2 of King Kong, both in the original iconic silver box sets. The films were in full CAV, and were the first films to have true special features sections that pioneered the entire concept of special features. It is often thought that this release of Kane has a commentary, but it does not. King Kong has the commentary. Citizen Kane has a visual essay in its supplemental section. So first, you have the benefit of getting the film on Laserdisc in much better quality than the tape releases and the CED release, in full CAV for full quality playback. It is still analog sound only, but this was still before digital sound was a thing on Laserdisc. But it was really the deluxe packaging, the care given to the film's presentation, and most of all, the supplemental features section that meant this was a game changer in the home video industry, which was still developing at this time. But this, along with the King Kong release, these two as a double whammy punch, just changed everything overnight. And it's befitting that Kane was their first choice. So the special features, while limited, it's just so important that they were even developed and made and included. So it doesn't necessarily matter that they're not a very long special features section. So it is primarily the visual essay by Bob Carringer, who is one of the great Wells scholars, loaded with stills. So you literally step through with your remote after the feature, as you do on most Criterion Laserdisc visual supplements. And then you also get the inclusion of the film's trailer, which is really important because it's one of the most innovative and fantastic trailers that was ever made. And the idea of even including a film's trailer on the video release was such a novelty and a new idea at the time that when films had trailers on disc or tape in the 1980s, it's like, holy crap, it's a special edition. It's got the trailer. Oh my God. So again, not the most jam-packed of special feature sections, but the fact that it even has a special feature section was mind-blowing. Now, as any Criterion collector will know, in the early days of their Laserdisc releases, there are many different variations and printing variations. So it's not just a case of having the original releases in their silver form and having the CAV edition as opposed to the CLV edition. So that there are little variations that you're only going to know about unless you get the copy side by side, or you talk to somebody who knows the differences, or you read detailed notes about them in write-ups online. So the first printing of Citizen Kane was in 1984. Then in 1985, Criterion released their second printing version, which is also in a silver box, but it adds a Janus Films and Voyager Press logo on the front of the actual silver package. So that's an easy way to distinguish them. It's also a sort of slip design, and the box then contains individual sleeves for the discs, and they are really beautifully done. So in that way, I think it's an even more visually appealing package than the very original first printing box design, but the contents of the discs are otherwise identical. So basically, it's just a slightly updated and honestly slightly fancier packaging with an extra logo on the cover, but it is still the same overall design and the same discs from the first printing. Then also in 1985, Image Entertainment decided to do their own Laserdisc, and Image did a lot of releases of the RKO library, and then eventually actually came up with their own branding, the RKO Classic Collection. They established a deal with the Turner Entertainment Group, which gave them access to the RKO library, and then when Turner eventually folded into the Warner Brothers realm, Image was still handling Laserdisc releases and some other releases for Warner and RKO films, and then in the tail end of Laserdisc, they were pretty much exclusively printing all Warner Brothers Laserdisc because they actually took over Laserdisc production for most major studios in the very tail end of the format because the studios had already switched their focus on to DVD production. So there's a long history of Image doing RKO and Turner and Warner Brothers associated titles. So it makes sense that they did their own Laserdisc of Kane in 1985. What's important about this, it is still analog-only sound. It is still using a print transfer, but it is this release that has the audio commentary. Paul Mandel does a pretty nice commentary track on the second analog track, but unfortunately you would call this today a selected scene commentary because it's very brief segments, and if you put them all together, it's about 30 to 35 minutes of commentary in the 2-hour film. So, you wish it was a full running commentary, but this was such a new thing still at the time that, before this, you really only had the King Kong track on the Criterion release to judge it against. So it's fascinating to hear a track from this early on and to hear somebody talking about Citizen Kane in 1985. But again, it's on the Image Entertainment release and not the Criterion release. So that's why it's an important piece of the Kane puzzle to look at, and it's really fascinating to listen to that track. But that is the real reason why you want to look at that release, because otherwise it's just another analog audio Laserdisc transfer from the 80s of a certain print source. In 1985 also came the first officially licensed RKO branded VHS tape release of Kane. It came in this green slipcase design. Sometimes it's in a clamshell case. Again, this would presumably be a print transfer, but of better quality than the previous non-RKO licensed official tape releases. So this 1985 RKO tape is pretty much the first I guess if you could call it the first studio official VHS release of Citizen Kane, and it should be of better quality in both the tape quality and the actual quality of the source they accessed, as opposed to the other labels probably using whatever they could get on the used market or from various rental sources or whatever, or even 16 millimeter sources, whereas this should be mastered from 35 millimeter sources. It also does not have hi-fi audio. It would take a little bit longer for Citizen Kane to get the superior VHS hi-fi audio encoding on VHS tape. A lot of VHS tapes would also be concurrently released with beta tapes throughout the 1980s, but beta did start to fall off relatively quickly at a certain point, and then it was only certain studios and certain labels that kept at least a decent beta tape production up. I have not seen really reference to a lot of Citizen Kane beta releases. It seems like all the labels releasing Citizen Kane were mostly focused on VHS entirely, but it is very possible that there are some beta versions that are floating around that, again, I just didn't uncover in my research. But again, it's not like this stuff is really documented, so you have to just do the best you can. Then lastly, for 1985, there is another Nostalgia Merchant VHS release. Again, this one seems to be almost the same cover design, just a little bit of color tweaking, and it has a copyright date of 1985, as opposed to the earlier Nostalgia Merchant video releases. This one also is still analog audio only and would be coming from whatever print source they had access to. In 1986, there was another Nostalgia Merchant VHS video I was able to discover. This one seems identical to the 1985 version, but with some slight cover printing differences, and this one is credited to being distributed by Fox Hills Video. So again, with all of these, it seems as if it's just changes in distribution and who's putting out the tapes, and the covers will be slightly different, and the copyright date will be slightly different. But my educated guess would be that the actual tape contents are just the same transfer being recycled over and over. I don't see them doing a new transfer, and again, it does not have hi-fi audio, so it's just analog audio only. Now, in 1986, RKO Video, which had just really started to take off in terms of it being a sort of more official studio label for the RKO library, they actually released another version of Citizen Kane, and it uses the exact same cover art design as their 1985 first VHS release. This is the 1986 Video 8mm tape version of Citizen Kane. It seems to be the same picture master and transfer, and it looks almost identical to the VHS release version of this same cover art from the year before. But Video 8, if you want to call it that, was an 8mm tape source that was a format that unfortunately was short-lived. It was an idea to sort of bring more of technologies that had been more developed for camcorders into the home video market, but it really didn't take off here in the U.S. They did have a bit more success with it overseas. There are quite a number of releases on Video 8 in Japan, for example, and it was also very successful for airlines because it was a lot easier to carry around and store, and it was basically a more streamlined, slightly smaller version of what you would get on a VHS tape or a Betamax tape in terms of the dimensions. So it seems there were a lot of films that actually were released on this format, not commercially though. So if you dig around for Video 8 releases, you will find a lot more modern films going up until the late 90s or even 2000 sometimes. And they go for high dollars because they were specifically made for airlines. But it's an interesting format to look at. I've never had any experience with it myself personally, but I have seen some tapes before. I don't know how much it would cost to get a working player these days, because I have to assume they'd be quite rare. The tapes themselves are very rare and usually go for quite a bit of money on eBay or other places. But I thought it was interesting that RKO decided that they were going to try and release some films on the Video 8mm format, including Citizen Kane. In 1986, we have the CIC video release in Japan on Laserdisc of the film, and to be honest, if you were to get any older 1980s analog release of the film on any format outside of the Criterion and Image Laserdisc releases, I think this would be the one of most interest, because higher quality being Laserdisc, and it is a direct print transfer. So here is the Japanese Laserdisc, again, from CIC Video in 1986. This is a print transfer, so it's analog sound only. It is not as good as other versions that will come later, of course, but it's still a really interesting variant, and it has this beautiful cover art that they used as part of this RKO selection collection. So you'll see a lot of RKO classic films that were released on Laserdisc in Japan with covers like this. And it went for a number of years, and they went through some different varieties, and I'll talk about the repressing of this with digital sound when we get to it a little bit later. But again, this is a rather nice disc. The black and white photography really jumps off the black jacket artwork, and the discs in this design in this series are really impressive. Again, though, it's not the greatest transfer in the world, because we are talking about a 1986 Japanese Laserdisc pressing. It does have hard-coded Japanese subtitles, as do almost all Japanese Laserdiscs, so you will have to live with that. If that bothers you, then you're going to be driven crazy by this. But it is a really impressive release for the time. The packaging, again, is excellent, and the obi strip has the custom information. To show you the rear as well, and I love that they actually kept the RKO logo there, made it custom blue, and again, all of the obi strips for this series match in this way. And if that wasn't enough, this series also includes a really nice full little booklet. So this is the full 12-inch Laserdisc jacket dimensions. Here we have a shot of the original release poster with the cast credits. Then it's a nice opening gatefold. Of course, unfortunately, all the writing is in Japanese, but you get the idea at least. And the stills are really well printed, which was not an easy thing to do on Laserdisc inserts at this time in the 1980s. And then there's the behind-the-scenes RKO story on the rear panel. Again, unfortunately in Japanese. It'd be cool to read this, but that's unfortunately not readable because I'm not fluent in Japanese. But again, beautiful shot of Kane there. And they didn't have to do this, but apparently in this series, most, if not all of these releases have some sort of insert if they weren't gatefolds. I do have one other in this particular series that's a gatefold and has the similar sort of photos and write-ups. And I have to say, these releases also remind me, they seem similar to the Japanese Hitchcock releases that I have a few of in terms of the layout and design on a black jacket with the central image. Then moving on to 1987, there was another Vidamerica release, this time with a white cover. Again, this seems like the same VHS tape, just updated for 1987, and you can differentiate it by it having this particular white-colored cover, as opposed to some of the earlier ones in various shades of blue and other colors. It's also seemingly the exact same tape, because once again, it does not have hi-fi sound, which was already becoming much more prevalent by this point in the late 80s. I'd also like to mention the Great American Classics film box set, bringing together 3 RKO titles. This was also from Vidamerica. There is no copyright date on them, but I would assume it seems like they came around this point in time. These 3 films were packaged together a number of times on VHS for some reason. I guess just the fact that they're 3 of the most famous RKO films. So it's, of course, Citizen Kane packaged with King Kong and Gunga Din. This in a custom slip box with a sort of leather case type effect and gold lettering, and then the tapes themselves have this sort of gold foil label, but they seem pretty much identical to the standalone Vidamerica releases of all 3 films, and again, all analog sound only with no hi-fi. There are a number of tape releases in the late 80s, early 90s that were sort of one-offs or mail-order tapes or sold at certain retailers that would be repackagings of already available standalone tapes with custom art. Sometimes like this, where it's a little generic-looking, but at least it's an interesting variant and a nice little slip box to have on your shelf. But again, for the most part, all of these variant one-offs were just repackagings for special markets. In 1987, we received the Criterion Third printing CAV box set on Laserdisc. This transitioned over into the company's then current black cover design, which honestly, in a lot of ways, I think is very underrated. This keeps the same cover image, the discs seem exactly the same, the contents are the same, and it retains all the extras from the first and second printings. Again, this just updates the cover to the then current design to keep everything in line with what was going on in '87 with the Criterion Collection. They did this with all of their original silver releases, which is why the silver releases are grouped together by collectors and highly prized for representing this sort of original Criterion lineup. But there is no reason to discredit the black cover versions because, again, they are exactly the same in terms of content. You do lose the custom sleeves of the second printing of the silver version. So if you like those, then you will have to seek out that version. That's the exclusive thing to that particular iteration of the box set. Also in 1987, Criterion released their CLV Slimmed Down Edition. So this is the film on a single CLV disc. It also has the new updated black cover art design. It is given the spine designation of 1A, which is how they would designate their CLV editions by adding the letter A after the particular number. This was meant as the more, budget-friendly option, and most, if not all, of the CLV editions would lack the special features sections. They did have them on some of the early ones, but I believe this one does not have the visual essay extra or the other extras of the CAV version. The King Kong release around this time period, the CLV version, actually does retain the audio commentary from the CAV release, pretty much because it's just an extra audio track. But very quickly they would realize that keeping the extras to the CAV versions was the more giving more incentive to purchase the fuller, more expensive CAV version to then get all the extras. And if they put it on the CLV versions, you wouldn't have that same incentive because you could just buy the budget version. So this is the most commonly available of the older pre-digital sound Criterion releases. It is by far the cheapest. And if you just want to see what Criterion's transfer looked like of Kane, this is the easiest way to do so. And again, it is still analog sound only, as are all of these Criterion pressings. In 1988, we got a major upgrade on VHS because it was the release of the first official studio licensed tape from a studio label that had some work put into actually working on the transfer and trying to use better elements. It's also the first tape release that I know of that actually has a hi-fi mono track. That is Turner's 1988 release from their new RKO collection. Now, this would go hand in hand with what Image Entertainment would do with their RKO releases on Laserdisc, and if you look at the tape and LD releases of all of these in the RKO banner, they are pretty much the same. So again, this seems to match up with what Image had already done on Laserdisc in 1985, and also with what Criterion was doing. It is still an element that's being used that has some damage and things, but the hi-fi mono was a giant upgrade on all of the previous VHS releases. Has a nice spine design and was done in this matching sort of sleeve that goes well with all the other releases in this RKO banner, which did run for a number of years. So this ran well into the 1990s in terms of the design. Just has a standard printed label. There is no actual sticker label on here. This was sold in a variety of different packages as well, with the primary one being this really interesting set that once again pairs it with both King Kong and Gunga Din. So this is the Film Series Classics box set, which there were several different sets of RKO films in similar packaging, but this is the primary one. So it's this very nice and actually embossed box with a nice texture on it that has very simple but very nice and classy printing on there. There's the titles. And then it's a lift top box. So I'm trying to show this on camera. Very simple and straightforward, but it does include some rather nice stills. These printed on very glossy photo paper, and they're actually quite large, as you can see. So that was a really nice surprise when I finally found one of these sets. Again, the tapes themselves are the exact same thing as you get in the standalone version, but I was just looking for a clean example of the 1988 tape, and I was actually able to get this entire box set for cheaper than what usually you have to pay for a single tape. So here is the Kane photo. And then here are all 3 tapes. As you can see, both Kong and Gunga Din were still sealed, so again, I just picked this up because I wanted to check out the 1988 tape transfer and look at the audio track. Again, it's still really solid, but it's not quite as good as versions that would follow later. But if you were looking for an older tape for whatever reason, this would be, your starting point for tapes in the 80s. This is the best of the 1980s VHS tape releases. The years 1991 and 1992 were very big for Citizen Kane because RKO and Turner were prepping to celebrate the film's 50th anniversary. This is when they were scouring around trying to find the best elements that survived and to cobble together a new preservation print to then use for all the new home video releases and also do a very limited theatrical reissue for the 50th anniversary. The biggest and best of these releases in terms of the scale, packaging, and content was actually the Criterion reissue, this being spine 142, so it gets its own new spine number. This is the big deluxe edition. This is the 3-disc full CAV edition using original poster art, and this is still probably the best cover the film has had on home video. It's debatable. There's a couple, but this is the one that really grabs you and finally uses original poster art to a wonderful effect. It's in the company's trifold design, so that's why this has some spine damage here and there. It's always very common for this to happen. It's also very hard to display and talk about on camera because you have the traditional gatefold type look, but then the other panel opens. So again, please forgive me for trying to do this on camera. The discs sort of slide around because you have this wonderful trifold. Again, much apologies for trying to get everything on camera here. But then this gives you not only the film's chapters, but then the actual chapters for the reprinted visual essay from the original release, so that has been carried over. The most important one is for the Legacy of Citizen Kane documentary. This gives you the chapter breakdowns for all of the various interviews that were done with a lot of famous film personnel in terms of the original cast and crew of the film who were surviving, and then also a lot of famous names of both directors, cinematographers, actors, so on and so forth, talking about the impact of Kane 50 years later. These are done in little soundbite type clips, and they're crammed all on the same disc side. So what happens is you actually get a screen with 3 sort of talking heads going at the same time. One will be on the digital track, and then the other 2 will be on the 2 analog tracks. So you have to switch tracks depending on who you want to listen to make it more of an interactive experience. It's a really cool manner of trying to make interviews more interactive, and it was a really cool thing for them to do for the 50th anniversary. The problem is, it seems like they taped interviews that were anywhere between 5 and 20 minutes, and you're only getting a little snippet of it. A lot of these interviews were reused for the Turner extras and their documentary on VHS. That was then carried over to other releases. Then on the new Criterion release, they actually go back and use some of these Laserdisc interviews and actually give you the full interview on some of them. Unfortunately, though, there are still a great number of interviews that are only on this Laserdisc release, and you're only getting a short segment of those. So we have a number of interviews that are still unreleased in their entirety all these years later, which is very frustrating because you just want to hear the rest of what they're saying. So at least we got some of them uncut on the Criterion UHD release, but I still hope someday that we can get to the rest of these. So here is the rear cover. Again, this giving you some information about the methodology of the interviews. It does port over the Carringer visual essay from the original release. It does also include Wells's early film Hearts of Age, which was thought lost for a very long time, and it's amazing to be able to see. It includes the theatrical trailer once again. The transfer is brand new, as I said. It seems to be shared from the Turner master that was prepared. And again, the film is in full CAV. The other big draw is this finally adds digital sound, but as I'll talk about with the next release, that can be deceptive. This is the best version Criterion released on LD. It is the best Laserdisc on a technical level, and it is full CAV with the most amount of extras, plus it ports over the old extras. The problem is with the film's audio, there was some cleanup applied, so this is not the best sounding version of the film on home video. In fact, when you look at the best sounding versions, this doesn't even really enter into the conversation, unfortunately. And until you get a bunch of releases and you compare them side by side, you wouldn't know that. So I went for this release first because I knew it was the big special edition, and it actually had PCM audio where the earlier ones did not. It is an improvement over the earlier ones in that fact, and also in picture, and the master was brand new, and this has all the extras in one place. So if you were to get only one Criterion Laserdisc release, it should be Spine 142 here to get all the extras and the full CAV presentation and digital audio. But don't go in thinking like me that this is the best audio presentation available, because unfortunately it is not. That's the one drawback to this, but you still should get a copy of this for the exclusive interview pieces, even though they are segments, unfortunately. And again, the packaging is excellent. I'm not a big fan of the trifold design because it is a bit unwieldy, and also it's very easy to get damaged spines. And but you know, it is a great example of what Criterion was doing with home video at this time and really trying to push the envelope. Now, also in the same year, you had the same exact cover art used on Spine 142A, which was the CLV single disc version of the film. So it has the same cover art on front and back, except the back removes the documentary section because you don't have the extras list. So if you're looking for this disc, or you're looking at a copy that has this art and has Spine 142, you have to be careful that you're not looking at the CLV version, because you'll see a lot of listings just show this picture or say Spine 142, or if you don't look carefully at the back, you'll think, oh, cool, it's the special edition. You buy it, you get it, and it's the CLV version. You can always tell because the back information about the documentary is not on the CLV standalone single disc version. But again, that came out in the same year because Criterion was releasing CLV slimmed down versions concurrently with their special editions like this one. In 1992, we also got the Image Entertainment attempt at a 50th anniversary release, which is, I think, the most creative of all of the covers the film has had on home video. So this is their 50th anniversary Citizen Kane release under their RKO Classics collection banner they had been doing on LD for some time. Now, this is still just a single CLV disc. It does not have bonus features, but it was utilizing the new transfer that had been spearheaded by Turner Entertainment, and they came up with this absolutely incredible jacket that mimics the New York Daily Inquirer paper from Citizen Kane, and actually uses the newspaper type design to start the jacket essay, which continues over onto the back. We get the famous still of Wells as Kane during the political campaign speech, and then the title in gold. So I really think this is one of the most creative jackets in the entirety of Laserdisc, and it's a strong contender for the best art design the film has ever had on home video. I think it's pretty much neck and neck between this and the Criterion Spine 142. I mean, they're all great in their own way, but this one has such a layer of ingenuity that you can't help but admire it. So then here is the rear, and apologies for any glare because this is still in the shrink wrap, but it has a nice selection of stills from the film, has a sort of newspaper type aesthetic to the actual background, so it's not a pure white, it's a sort of browned white to give it the idea of it being paper on, I should say newspaper and with newsprint, and then the jacket essay continues onto the back. Now, it's just a single CLV disc. It doesn't have any of the Criterion extras. It unfortunately doesn't have any extras at all. The old commentary that was on their 1985 LD was not ported over, and with good reason, because there's a little blurb here on the bottom that talks about, for your added enjoyment, we've included 2 versions of the audio track. What this means is the digital track is a cleaned up version of the new audio from this new master, where they use Dolby noise reduction techniques, and then the analog tracks, which are actually containing the unrestored track. So for a long time, this was thought to be, and myself included, this was thought to be the best audio available for the film because it doesn't have any heavy-handed noise reduction applied to it. Different releases handle this in different ways, but for the longest time, again, myself and a lot of others thought this was the best you could do because all other releases have some form of noise reduction. This, in fact, is what I wish a lot of modern releases would still do today. I talk about it a lot on other reviews that I do, but having the option to have an unrestored track can really be helpful when a lot of restoration attempts do unfortunately remove elements of the original soundtrack in addition to hiss and background noise. Audio restoration is a very tricky thing to do, and when done right, it is beautiful, but it can very often be a bit too heavy-handed. So again, the analog track is a superior listening experience to the digital track, and it's a shame they didn't put that on the digital track, which is a much higher quality standard in terms of the format, comparing it to the analog track of the Laserdisc, because Laserdisc analog is technically not as good as VHS analog, and especially not as good as VHS HiFi, which will be very important when we talk about the next release. But this is still a really solid, wonderful Laserdisc presentation. Again, it is rather similar to what you get on the Criterion Spine 142. So if you were to compare the CLV version without extras to this CLV disc from Image, they are pretty much very, very similar. So basically, this was the Image version of what Criterion did on their CLV release, because Image still had the RKO license. So obviously, they wanted a version of Citizen Kane to match their collection as well. But again, the real draw here is the unrestored audio on the analog track and this absolutely amazing package design. So we come to the Turner release, and as I alluded to before, this one is important for its audio track, and this is really the most important release in all of this video history because of what I discovered when I started digging more into Kane. So the standalone tape got a special new transfer from this new protection element that was generated for the Anniversary as part of the same project. So again, it's going to go hand in hand with the Image and Criterion Laserdiscs from the same time period. But it got a much fancier, slightly embossed VHS slipcover. So here it is, the 50th anniversary tape, and this is actually the very tape I had growing up. So this was my childhood copy, the first copy I ever owned, and the one I watched for the first time. Again, you can see that sort of gold foil type embossing there, which is also on the sides. So here is the rear. It's, again, a lot fancier than any release on tape in terms of the art. It's very classy looking, and with the gold foil, it looks much more impressive on the shelf or sitting in stores. But again, this is using the same new preservation master from the new preservation print source they had compiled. Here is the label as well, which gives you the 50th anniversary credit, letting you know for sure that this is the 50th anniversary tape. Now, in terms of the contents, it is the film only. There was a companion documentary made as well called Reflections on Citizen Kane. It is actually compiled from the same Criterion interviews, but it doesn't use all of the various people in terms of the number of interviews. It uses a select few, and you actually get a little bit more footage from compared to what you get on the Criterion supplement. And it's also intercut with clips from the film. So it runs, around 30 minutes or so. Some versions of this do include it on the same tape as would some later releases, and then after the VHS era, that documentary pretty much disappeared from all releases. Of course, on the Criterion Blu-ray UHD current release, you're getting the longer form interviews for some of those. So once again, it's just another version of these same interviews that we've still never gotten all 100% of them uncut. But at least it was getting to see some more footage, and it is the same interviews, so it's not like you're going to get brand new, different interviews than what was already on the Criterion release. And the 30 minutes is deceptive because it is intercut with clips from the film and a narrator linking the clips and the interview pieces. But this also came in a number of varieties. So this is the standalone version, the standard tape, and this is what you'll commonly find floating around. But the other editions actually were several different, actually it was two box sets pretty much. There was a slimmed down version which had the single tape that had the documentary on it included as well, plus a book and a nice slip box along with some lobby cards and other printed materials. However, the full box set is a much bigger affair, and it'll take me a minute to get all of it on camera, so bear with me for a moment. So this big behemoth is the 50th anniversary limited collector's edition. This is a hand numbered, or it's actually stamped, so it's a numbered limited set, which is the most extensive packaging any release of Citizen Kane has ever had to this day. It's one of the few, well, actually one of the notable instances where VHS got a really substantial box set with extras and swag and physical materials, and Laserdisc did not. Usually it's the other way around. Sometimes VHS releases, in terms of box sets, got a counterpart to their Laserdisc edition, but it just has VHS tapes inside a big box instead of LDs. But there is no Laserdisc equivalent box set. Basically, Criterion did their CAV Spine 142, and Turner put this big thing together. So this has full embossing on the box. It has that nice premium sort of faux leather feel to it. You have the spine, of course, and this is actually numbered. So this is number 7160. Now, of course, I could have never have bought this or afforded this as a kid, and I didn't even know it existed at the time because I was growing up, and this obviously came out when I was far too young. But again, this is a behemoth of a set, so it's quite heavy, and then the entire thing just slips out. Now, the problem with this release, like some Laserdisc sets, is that because it's so heavy that everything wants to sort of, slide around in the plastic trays inside. But this, in particular, is so heavy, and it's a folding type design that even though I purchased this still sealed, the glue that holds the plastic trays starts to separate from the actual material because the contents inside are so big and heavy. So it is very cumbersome. It is unfortunate that happens, but basically what you do is you unfurl it. And again, this takes some doing because it is very heavy. So you have the first plastic panel, and this is probably the pièce de résistance and something you will never see again. This is very much something that they would do in box sets in this era when they were really going for premium feel. So here we have this very large black book, and you wonder, oh, what could this be? This is the entire original shooting script for Kane, fully reprinted in full size. Some box sets like the Wizard of Oz Ultimate Oz box set on VHS and Laserdisc did the same thing with the shooting script, but it's a really, truly impressive thing because, again, this is the entirety of the shooting script, right down to having the title page, and everything has been reprinted. So this is the entire shooting script, right down to having the News on the March in its entirety. So that has been fully reprinted and recreated for your reading pleasure. And again, because this was the pre-internet era, this is a really nice thing to have if you were, looking at this in the early 90s and you just wanted to bask in the film's glory once more. The only problem, again, because it's slid around in this package all these years and it's just in a plastic tray, there is some damage on the actual pages of the spine where the plastic has sort of compressed the pages a little bit, but that's to be expected after sliding around in this thing all this time and it being packed so tightly to begin with. So it's just sort of scuffed the page edges, but it's otherwise in perfect shape. And it's got a nice laminated cover, so it does have a slight quality feel to it. So basically you can fold the entire thing out flat and you will have 3 plastic panels that hold everything. Apologies for not getting this on camera because this thing is very heavy, and also, like I said, the plastic tray pieces have already mostly separated, and I've had to sort of place them back on so they can, sort of re-solidify the original glue. Again, I purchased this sealed. I was just trying to find another tape copy, and I wanted to check this out, and I found one of these sets for extraordinarily cheap, so I couldn't pass up the chance to check out the full limited set. But again, the packaging, while it's impressive, it is very unwieldy, and if you do have one of these sets, or if you do want to get one of these sets, you will have to be careful because the weight of everything, it doesn't react well being this old with the plastic trays just being glued in and it being a sort of trifold, fold-out type design. In terms of the rest of the contents of the bonuses, there are some really lovely photographs on nice photo stock. The only problem with these is I don't know if these somehow got misprinted back in the day or they somehow got too hot or something, but they have unfortunately faded But I have to say, it gives it this interesting type of effect. So this is obviously not what was intended, but it gives a certain archaic feeling of the past to this set. But originally, these would have been, nice and pristine back in 1991, 1992. You can see some are better off than others, but again, it adds a certain effect and charm to this particular package. Here's the shot of our heroic trio and their glory days at the Enquirer. And then, in a really great touch, they reproduced some of the original selling materials for the film. So this was something designed for distributors and theater owners in trying to sell the film to their audiences. So this is some of RKO's marketing campaign pieces, printed into this really nice color booklet. Well, I say booklet, but of course being much more full book size. And this is giving you, again, all the various ways they were trying to sell the film and a lot of things that you were not used or things that you don't commonly see, in addition to some really cool variants of the main posters, like what we see on the Criterion 142 spine release, but with a red Citizen Kane title, for example. Here's our suggestion for a lobby poster. And then more publicity materials about Kane. And then more of their publicity campaign materials. And then the rear shows you another rendering of the way what became the main A poster for the film, the main theatrical release poster. This is just basically an earlier mock-up of what it eventually became. What is not included in here physically is what you had to fill out this mail-away card for. So, unfortunately, I don't have the original poster that came with this. And basically, poster-wise, was just replicating what is on the VHS cover itself, but just as a poster. So I wish I had that as well, because I do really like the VHS cover for this release. But what you did was you filled this out, and they would then mail you the poster, because they didn't want to fold it up in here and ruin it with a bunch of creases. The main draw of the extra material is this beautifully rendered hardcover edition of the first iteration of Harlan Lebo's book on Citizen Kane. He's since expanded it, and actually just recently, this past year, came out with an even newer expanded version that I really want to check out. It's now subtitled A Filmmaker's Journey, but this is the original iteration. So we have the VHS art here on a book cover jacket, again with nice embossing. It's a hardcover, so it's got really premium feel to it. And then we have that poster mock-up here on the back as well. So again, this is the first iteration. There's the end papers, which is a great touch. So this is entitled the 50th Anniversary Album, but this is basically the first iteration of what his Filmmaker's Journey book became. And this is a really nice and very well done publishing for this time period, like a lot of the fancier books in Laserdisc editions. It's of course loaded with stills, so there's a great shot of Wells when he was working on his pre-production days on Heart of Darkness, which was the first film to be made under the Mercury contract before RKO scrapped it. You can see behind him the I equals I, the idea of his first-person singular concept of using a first-person perspective camera viewpoint for Heart of Darkness that was dropped, but certain elements did make it over into Kane. This is still a great way to learn more about the film and to re-experience the film in book form, but again, it has sort of been supplanted by Lebo's later Filmmaker's Journey books, which again, he just published a new updated version, so technically a third iteration of this. You can get this book separately. It is a really nice piece, but it's also really amazing that they printed the whole thing and included the hardcover version here in the box set. But again, you will have to deal with the fact that, it's a lot older now and these are heavier items. And as I was going over the book, I actually had the plastic tray it was in actually pop out. So do keep in mind this is a set you will want to be very careful with. If you get one of these, it's very heavy and it is a little unwieldy because these things were not meant to be so heavy and sit in these plastic containers all these years. So it's just the downside of this. It is very unwieldy and you will have to deal with the quirks of the actual fold-out packaging. Here's the insert showing you all of the contents of the limited edition VHS box set. Again, there is a slimmed-down version that just has the book along with the picture material, and then it has a single tape with the documentary added at the end of the feature. The box art is the same on the exterior slip box, but it is noticeably much thinner, and it's a bit taller too. So if you see just a differently shaped version of this box, but the actual packaging looks the same, it is the slimmed down version with just a single tape, a version of the book, and then some of the inserts, but not all of them, and certainly not the screenplay either. Here is the Reflections on Citizen Kane tape. Again, the slimmed down box puts this at the end of the feature on the same tape. Later releases would do the same thing, so it's really cool to have in its original iteration. This is 28 minutes long, and it has some very slight extensions to the footage of the interviews used from the Criterion release, but again, with a lot of clips from the film mixed in and a narrator to bridge the gaps. I wish this had been kept in some form on the Warner releases that came later. I wish we could get the full-length interviews that for all of them that had been recorded by Criterion or Turner back for this project. But this is just another fun way to see a tiny bit more footage, but edited into an old-fashioned video documentary form. Again, this is the only standalone release of it. Every other version is just tucked on at the end of the feature film once you finish it on the VHS tape release. And then here is the tape inside, which was still sealed. I picked this up originally just because I wanted a brand new copy of the tape for the reason that I checked my childhood version, and even though it was worn and had some damage, because I bought it used originally anyway way back when, the importance of this release is that this is, to my knowledge, the best sounding version of the film available anywhere. This has, again, it's from the same new preservation master. It has hi-fi audio, but it is not aggressively noise reduced like the restored digital versions on both the Image Laserdisc and the Criterion Laserdisc as well, that use the same new preservation master. And so this is very much like what is on the Image Laserdisc analog track, but in a much higher quality because it is VHS HiFi. Again, this has detail that is not present on any other release, and after this point, there are further noise reduction passes and restoration attempts on the film's audio and the DVD and Blu-ray realm that have gone beyond even what the noise reduction techniques at this time did. So the astonishing thing, and the thing that really astounded me and then made me start a whole new realm of research, is the fact that, as far as I can tell, and as far as every copy I've been able to check, the best possible audio presentation for Citizen Kane is the hi-fi mono track on this very 1992 VHS tape release for the film's 50th anniversary. It sounds better than any other release, and actually very noticeably so when you compare them directly. So I've done other videos on this subject, but that is why I wanted to get a brand new copy to then do a clean transfer and see if it was without the audio wear of my original tape, which it indeed was. There is some noise and some hiss, but it is natural noise and hiss, and I'm fine with keeping that as a trade-off if that means being able to hear the film without any loss of important frequencies, especially in music and the higher frequency range, which frequently gets wiped out of most audio restorations of classic era mono films. So if there is one older release to have of Citizen Kane, it is actually this particular Turner 50th anniversary VHS tape release, specifically because the hi-fi audio of this tape is the best sounding version of Citizen Kane that exists on home video, to my knowledge. And again, it is a very noticeable difference. There are some very good sounding audio presentations of the film, don't get me wrong. In particular, I was very pleased that the Criterion version sounds far better than most of the versions that preceded it, but it is still in a distant third place behind the Image analog on the Laserdisc release, and that is still second to this VHS HiFi from the Turner restoration tape. So this is the VHS tape to own of the film if you're interested in owning an old tape release. And again, it is astonishingly still the best sounding version of Citizen Kane that exists on home video. I should again note that the tape itself is identical to the standalone version, so you don't have to go for the full bulky box set if you don't want to, but the box set itself is rather inexpensive and it has some great, fantastic pieces of physical media swag, if you will, but it is a very heavy and rather unwieldy box, especially now that it's getting way on up there in years. So you will have to keep that in mind, but it's a really impressive package and without question the most elaborate and the most item-filled release the film has ever received on any format. It's also the hardest dang thing to work with when it's just sitting on your lap. Don't mind me, I'm just trying to get my Citizen Kane box back together. This was the bulk of the restoration attempts made on Kane, so because they put so much work into it, this is really the version that stood for quite some time. In 1993, CIC Video in Japan put out another Laserdisc release, this with seemingly almost identical cover art to the 1986 version. The real difference here is this one adds a digital mono soundtrack in addition to the analog mono of the original release. Now, I don't have this version, but it has a slightly different obi strip, which is how you tell them apart, and of course a different catalog number. I don't know if it is using the Turner version. I would assume that they were, because that's the only Japanese Laserdisc release that was done in the 1990s at that time. It is possible it is reusing the 1986 master, just adding digital sound, which they did with a lot of releases in Japan. Again, that's what I've discovered about the Hitchcock releases with a similar cover. There were a number of sort of stealth digital audio releases that came out. It is possible this is one of those. It is possible it's using the Turner master. Again, I don't know because there is no information about it, and I've never actually been able to view one myself. But it's also rather confusing because the cover and obi strip are almost identical to the 1986 release I showed earlier. Next, in 1996 was the Turner Classic Movies rebranded VHS release in the very nice TCM style. TCM did certain titles under the Warner Brothers library at this time because everything had switched over in the various Turner deals. So this carries a Turner Home Entertainment logo, and TCM branded tapes were available for a lot of classic films, primarily RKO releases. But they did a good number of these, but they are still ones you don't see all the time, and it was never a widespread thing, unfortunately, because I do really like this series, and there's always some original artwork on the back. This adds a custom introduction from Robert Osborne, very similar to what he would have done if you saw Citizen Kane back in the 90s on TCM. So that's a really nice flashback to the past for those like me who grew up with TCM. And it has some custom TCM, what they used to use for all their intros and bumpers and things. So you get that. So basically this is like if you taped Citizen Kane off of TCM in that regard. It also includes the trailer, which is cool. And then at the very end, it repeats the Reflections on Citizen Kane documentary. That's, it's the same exact thing as what's on the standalone VHS tape. It's just included here. Now, in terms of the tape itself, you get the printed on TCM logo on the tape itself. Now, I wanted to try this version, and so I tracked this tape down to see if it was any better than the 50th anniversary tape. It is the same master, so it's basically the same transfer, but unfortunately, like most mid to late 90s VHS tapes and beyond, the audio levels have been raised significantly, so there is some clipping, unfortunately. This is something I found the more I look at various old VHS tapes, that once you hit a certain point in the mid-1990s, it seems most, if not all, VHS tapes were mastered at a far louder level. So again, while it's the same great non-noise reduced track as the 50th anniversary tape, it unfortunately has been volume boosted to a point that While it's still a fine presentation for VHS, it's actually inferior to the earlier 50th anniversary tape. So, but again, it's the same master. It's just that the volume has been raised, which is unfortunate. But you still get the custom TCM packaging, and you get the custom Robert Osborne intro. And if you're a TCM fanatic, it's a nice piece to have. But again, it's not essential. That's the real draw of this, is the TCM factor of this tape. But otherwise, it is just another version of the 50th anniversary release. And that's how it stood until the turn of the new millennium. So 2001 rolls around, and we are at the 60th anniversary of the film, which is when Warner Brothers decided to do another restoration process to finally update what had been done in the early 1990s. This meant access to digital tools, and also meant the first DVD release of Citizen Kane, which was released in 2002. So they slightly missed the 2001 anniversary, just as the 50th anniversary did, because those releases sort of straddled 91 and 92. But anyway, this was the film's debut on DVD. It came in the 2-disc slipcase design, which Warner Brothers favored for their classic titles. A particular design I'm very fond of and miss and wish they would go back to, because it has a nice premium feel with great imagery. It's also easy to stock. It's easy to put on the shelf, easy to handle, and it's not over elaborate. And it also doesn't attract a lot of damage like certain packaging designs such as steelbooks. So unfortunately, I don't have my copy anymore. I gave it away a long time ago because I upgraded to the Blu-ray that came later from Warner Brothers. But the new mastering was unfortunately handled by Lowry Digital. This was earlier on in their DVD career, and the picture master is really quite terrible because the film has a very flat look. It's in terms of the grayscale. It has excessive digital noise reduction, as Lowry was known for at the time. So there are actually things in scenes that have been erased by digital noise reduction, and the film has a very grainless looking appearance, in addition to looking much flatter than it should in terms of the grayscale. In addition, there is some over sharpening as well. It is really a terrible DVD experience. It's a terrible way to watch the film, and unfortunately that's how a lot of people saw the film for the first time, and that's how it was stuck until the Blu-ray release. It is really one of the worst DVDs ever released on a technical standpoint because of the way it handles the film, and it's one of the most obvious and terrible examples of what Lowry Digital did in the DVD realm. That's not to say they didn't do good work and that they didn't have great intentions, but it is just a terrible thing to go back and look at, especially when we have far greater things visually, not in terms of resolution, but in terms of ways the film was handled properly. So outside of the earliest tape releases and the non-studio releases that I can only guess at how they looked, I think the Lowry Digital DVD master that is on the Warner Brothers DVD is just about the worst visuals of any release of Citizen Kane, simply due to the way that the film was manipulated in the digital realm. So that was really a major problem that the film had and had to deal with until the Blu-ray release came and all that stuff was finally undone. On the audio side, things were really just as bad because this was where the film got hit with a massive dose of noise reduction, and a lot of digital tools were applied. So this resulted in a technically cleaner presentation of the audio, but a much more flat and canned sounding, if you will, version that lacks a lot of the high-end frequencies. And so it itself is one of the lesser sounding releases of the film, and is very much a great thing to point to see what heavy-handed noise reduction to a classic mono soundtrack can do. So on a technical level, the DVD itself was a gigantic disappointment and a major problem. On the extras side, things were a lot better. This was the first time that new extras were generated. This is where the commentaries from Roger Ebert and Peter Bogdanovich first appeared and then had been ported over to the successive releases. We also got the inclusion of some additional extras, Roger Ebert narrating a track over some vintage production stills, a little bit more information about the film, but the highlight of the extras package is really the commentaries. They also included the then relatively recent PBS aired documentary from American Experience called The Battle Over Citizen Kane. And while that is a well-intentioned documentary and won several awards, it unfortunately casts an inaccurate light on the situation between Wells and the Mercury Theater and RKO and William Randolph Hearst and Citizen Kane. A lot of people have seen that and sort of take that as the gospel of what happened. It sort of rewrites history a little bit and tries to portray Wells himself as a Hearst-type figure already, and like it was a battle of mirrored opposites between the two gigantic egos, which it really was not. So unfortunately, it sort of plays around with history a little bit, and that's why I don't really return to it often, and I try to make sure that people don't use that as their primary source for Citizen Kane information, because there are far better options out there and many other things that are far more historically accurate. So that's why I don't really mind that it is no longer included in the extras package on the modern Criterion release, who went with a much better documentary. That's the main extra because that takes up the entirety of disc 2 of the DVD set. So that is what consisted of Warner's extras package, which, at least it was a decent amount of extras, but it always felt lacking because it was Citizen Kane and it's a film you could fall into, and there can never be enough supplemental features on Citizen Kane, but at least Warner was trying in the DVD era. And that's how things stood for some time. However, there was a concurrent release along with the DVD, which also shared the same master and packaging design. So here we have the final VHS tape release of Citizen Kane with the updated master with the DVD art on a VHS sleeve. This came out concurrently with the DVD. It looks really impressive, as I do really like what Warner did with the art for both originally the DVD, and that carried over here to the VHS tape release. So this is the film. It doesn't include the documentary anymore, but it does include the trailer and an original newsreel at the start before the feature. We get an updated printed label with the film's title font. And again, I tracked this down because I wanted to check the technical quality of the tape itself. Like I feared, this is just a VHS copy of the DVD master with all of its problems added onto a VHS tape. So the resolution is much lower, so those things might not be as obvious. The audio does have hi-fi, but it again is the heavily noise-reduced DVD audio. So it is basically just the DVD on a VHS tape, but it looks rather impressive, and this is the final VHS tape release the film would have. So this ends a very long line of many different VHS releases. We had to wait another decade for the film's 70th anniversary approaching to get another home video revisit. That arrived in the form of 2011's Blu-ray release, here in the full limited edition set with the beautiful jigsaw puzzle motif that when you hold it in the light, you can see the textured shapes start to appear. So it's not as apparent when you're looking at just pictures of it. When you hold it in your hands, this, of course, is alluding to Susan Alexander Kane's very famous fondness for jigsaw puzzles, which, of course, was another point of contention with Hearst because it was seen as a direct attack on Marion Davies, who was known for loving to put together jigsaw puzzles. So, of course, having the rosebud motif on the back is a nice touch. So this is the deluxe release. The standard Blu-ray is available as well as a standalone. It is a single disc Blu-ray in here, and the additional discs are just supplemental discs to the Blu-ray release. What this meant, though, is that Warner Bros. Again went back to the well and used digital tools to bring the film into HD. And thank goodness all of the Lowry digital work was thrown out, and this time we got a proper transfer of the film, which meant you could finally get rid of the god-awful DVD with its massive issues. And we finally got a presentation of the film that was once again correct looking, finally representing Greg Toland's legendary photography much more in the light that it was intended to be seen. This does not have any DNR issues, doesn't have any over-sharpening issues. The grayscale is finally balanced once again, so it looks like it should, and it was one of the most dramatic improvements from DVD to Blu-ray in terms of the presentation of the film, not necessarily the uptick in resolution, which also was incredible to see. So again, this is the limited package. So inside we have this fold-out digipack, again carrying the jigsaw puzzle motif. So this folds out to give you 2 profile shots of Kane in various ages. Panel 1 with the Blu-ray. There's a panel with Citizen Kane. Then panels 2 and 3 house discs 2 and 3, which are themselves just DVDs. So here is once again a copy of my the documentary I'm not very fond of, Battle Over Citizen Kane, with its inaccuracies. And then disc 3 is the DVD copy of the film RKO 281, which is ostensibly based around the making of Citizen Kane. It does take quite a number of liberties with history, but it is interesting to see famous faces from today take on the roles of the major cast and crew behind Citizen Kane and RKO itself. And it's not a film I return to very often, but it is nice that it was included here for posterity's sake. That's the disc contents of the limited set. Again, all of the DVD extras were ported over to the Blu-ray, and that's pretty much the entirety of the extras of the Blu-ray. But again, the Blu-ray itself is just a single disc that was also sold as a standalone. Here's the rear of the digipack with the credits. We also got a nice little portfolio of physical items made to look like Rosebud itself, which again is a nice touch. That opens into this folder portfolio. The printed materials include a variety of original materials of the original press book and credits, and then invitations to the actual original premiere dates, a copy of Wells's original RKO contract, which is an incredible touch, a copy of the receipt for Orson's studio party. Again, the level of detail and the things they chose to reproduce is really impressive. A copy of the pre-budget estimate for the film, a copy of the RKO press release about the announcement of Citizen Kane, a copy of the box office Blue Ribbon Award the film won, a copy of the press release radio statement by Wells talking about the film not necessarily being directly based on William Randolph Hearst, and then here is a reproduction of the original souvenir program. So this is in really nice detail. So even though it is obviously smaller, it's in color with a mixture of color and black and white stills, and it is very nicely printed. So this is a wonderful bit of physical memorabilia that's doing a great job, but not being something really superfluous or taking up a lot of extra space. And then we get this nice little hardback book inside with a interior booklet essay, which is very much what you would get in a typical Warner Digibook of the Blu-ray time period. So it's nice enough, and it's nice to have a physical book again. Of course, it's not going to compare to the Harlan Lebo book in the VHS box set, but it's still rather nice. And if you are going to get any of the Warner Blu-ray editions, the limited edition is far nicer than just the standalone Blu-ray only release. So again, that is the limited edition 2011 Blu-ray set. Again, the picture transfer was a gigantic leap forward, but unfortunately the audio was the same heavily noise-reduced track as what was on the DVD pretty much. With some light adjustments here and there, it does seem relatively the same as the DVD audio. So the audio was not the improvement of rolling back the changes of the DVD like the picture transfer was. So like a lot of Warner classic Blu-ray releases around this time period, the picture transfer was a nice leap forward, but the audio stayed pretty much the same. Yeah, but it's now losslessly encoded on this release. And this is how the film stood for quite some time, and how I thought it was going to remain, unfortunately, with audio that was still not super great, but at least with a far improved picture transfer. And due to the elements available, I didn't think that anything would be an improvement until Warner decided to revisit the film in 4K, which I expected to happen at some point, but definitely not the surprise announcement that came when we heard Criterion was going to reacquire rights to Citizen Kane and basically come full circle, which, it being the original Spine #1 first release in 1984, it made perfect sense why it would be one of their very first 4K UHD releases. So of course, that brings us to this brand new Criterion 4K UHD Blu-ray combo release, which is their spine 1004. So this is of course different spine numbering than the Laserdisc days, but still we go from spine number 1 to spine 1004. With the brand new updated art, this is the 3 Blu-ray 1 UHD combo release with a brand new supplemental features section that does include longer uncut versions of the interviews first seen on the original Spine 142 Criterion Laserdisc, in addition to some great new materials and a new commentary, in addition to the previous 2 commentaries which are carried over from the Warner Brothers releases. But the primary draw of this is the brand new 4K restoration and transfer handled by Warner Brothers in conjunction with Criterion. So obviously this is what Warner would have released on UHD by themselves, and they did in the UK. So if you buy the UK release, you can get the Warner Brothers version of this same 4K restoration, and also some particular swag that we would have gotten over here had it not been licensed to Criterion. The picture restoration it does the best with the elements it has. It is an improvement in every way over the Warner Brothers release, but it is in slight areas that usually only people with trained eyes or people very accustomed to the film or very knowledgeable about what Greg Toland and Wells were doing visually will be able to understand, especially again in conjunction with the elements that survive and the elements that the restoration was derived from. So most people will look at this and think it's not much of an improvement over the Warner Brothers release, but the improvements are much more on the subtle side. This is without question the best the film has ever looked on home video on any release to date. It does an amazing job visually with what is available and with recreating the film experience with Citizen Kane in the home. The unfortunate problem was the very first release like this had a defective Blu-ray feature disc. Seemingly something went wrong in the conversion from HDR to SDR of the 4K master and resulted in the film transfer going completely bad about at least 20 to 30 minutes in. There was a replacement program, which meant we had to destroy our discs and wait for Criterion to send a replacement disc, which they did. It did take some time, but eventually got here, and it was very easy to do. So now this set is complete with properly working discs. Again, the extras package is fantastic and carries over the necessary things from the Warner release. Again, swapping out the Battle Over Citizen Kane documentary for the far superior 1990s BBC documentary, which itself is rarely seen. The other surprise was the film's audio. I assumed the track would be the same as the Blu-ray on the Warner release, and then when Criterion did it, I assumed that it would probably be the same again. However, it is a new audio transfer with new restoration work done and is a dramatic improvement over the immediate releases before, particularly the DVD and the previous Blu-ray, which needed great improvement. So this will be, it is a gigantic improvement in sound over those previous releases, and most people will be just blown away at how much better this sounds. But when you have experience with prior versions of the film, this is still outdone by older editions. So I would say this is the third best sounding version of the film. I do think it is outdone by the analog unrestored track on the Image Laserdisc, and even more so by the 50th Anniversary Tapes VHS HiFi track. So again, we now do have at least 3 great sounding versions, and the current in-print restored version actually does sound very good. But it could sound better because I do think it does have a bit too much noise reduction in places, and you do lose some of the important high frequencies. And when you go back to these older releases, you can tell the difference very clearly. But this is not to say that this version sounds bad at all. Do not get me wrong on that. But it is definitely the third best sounding version. However, I am very happy there was any improvement. I just think it's a shame that the otherwise perfect new release in terms of the technical specs could not still beat the old Image LD and the old Turner VHS tape. So Again, it's unfortunate, but at least this sounds far better than the previous immediate releases, and it does show that new audio restoration work was done because it was badly needed. Again, it's a brand new design for the art, so we have the slipcase with the new K motif design. Then the interior, and this release, it's no secret, the packaging leaves a lot to be desired, and many have bemoaned its the choice to do this type of design, which Criterion has not really done before. And I myself am no fan of this particular design, which is very unwieldy, very difficult to use, not helpful to your disc, can damage your disc. It's just... It was nice they tried something cool and a bit different for Citizen Kane, but this is really an appalling packaging design in terms of its usage and its ability to be picked up and handled, and just for containing and ease of use for getting the discs in and out. But the idea is you have the digipack fold out, again with the rosebud motif on the back. Then we open to feature Kane in various stages of his life, revealing the letters in Kane's name. Again, this is very difficult to do on camera, but I will try my best. So then we reveal the N, but then you have to fold upwards to reveal the E, and you see the discs are contained interior pockets like this, and these cardboard slip-out sleeves. And then we have to fold down to reveal young Kane, and then there's this oversized booklet for Criterion, but it's just simply slotted in the center, and it just flops around. So you have to actually be sure and take that out, otherwise you drop it and risk damaging it. So then we have the four corners folded out like this, and then in the interior panel we have the snow globe from the opening in Xanadu. Again, it is very difficult to get the discs in and out. As you can see, the panels flop around, and this is a very unwieldy design that was very ill-advised. I think this is one of the worst packaging examples in in-home video in terms of it being unwieldy, not good for the disc content, and just a gigantic pain all around. Again, I commend people for having trying to do something a bit different and a bit fancy and a bit special, but this was a bad idea. The booklet is really nice. It's a bit bigger than most Criterion Blu-ray releases, and there is a really nice essay contained inside in the usual Criterion style. Again, we have the feature film on a 4K UHD disc with an HDR grade on it in addition, and then on a Blu-ray disc, and then discs 2 and 3 are entirely devoted to the supplemental features. This is an incredible release. It is a must-own release in spite of the fact that the packaging is a bit horrendous and infuriating, and the fact that the interviews from the Laserdisc release are still not 100% complete, and that the audio itself, even though it is restored and better than previous releases, is still not as good as the best of the older releases, and could have been perfect. It's rather close, but it's rather frustratingly not as good as the old 50th anniversary releases on VHS and Laserdisc. But in all other respects, this is an excellent must-own release in both Blu-ray and 4K, and the new extras are fantastic, and they're so great that the only problem with the extras, besides the still not having 100% of the LD interviews complete, is that they really only scratch the surface. They barely scratch the itch of wanting to know more about Citizen Kane. So it just gets you reinvested in unraveling the mystery of the film and its enduring legacy, and just sets you off on another indefinite amount of time wanting and trying to learn as much about the film and Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater as you possibly can. So that brings us to the end of the home video history of Citizen Kane up to this point, and the Criterion 4K UHD Blu-ray combo release I have here. So it's far more convoluted than you would think. There are many different releases of the film over different formats, and far more than I originally realized when starting out to make this video. I think it's important to look at films and their home video release history to understand how not just they evolved over time and how people evolved in terms of the methodology of being able to see them, but how the home video industry itself evolved and how the special features evolved over time. time as they developed along with the film's releases. And as in this case, there are times where you find particular older releases have extras that have not been carried over, or particular points that are really important. And most especially, you find that sometimes older releases have superior audio transfers in terms of the quality of the audio on them. So I think it's extremely important to look at the home video histories, if you will, of any film that you are interested in, and to always realize that at its best, home video is still an approximation of the original theatrical release experience, and at its best can fully recreate that. But it does need help, and it needs research and assistance to get that way. And not every video release is perfect. The vast majority are not. And sometimes issues can get introduced, and they will eventually have to be ironed out, such as what happened on the really terrible DVD release and its particular issues. And that took about 10 years to get fixed on the Warner Brothers Blu-ray release. So that's why I wanted to put this together, and I've done some home video histories before in other videos, but for Kane, I knew it was something that I really wanted to do, and this being one of the true immortal films that will never die, and a film that has lived on in spite of its lack of initial success and gaining the cult following on the 1950s reissues. It really came back to life like a phoenix rising again. That's part of Kane's appeal and Kane's legacy, so that's why I felt it was important to do a home video history of Citizen Kane, and that's why I decided to make it my first tried and true standalone home video history piece. So again, that brings us to the current Criterion Collection 4K UHD and Blu-ray combo release. And that's my overview of the home video history of Citizen Kane. Again, it's not 100% comprehensive, it's not 100% complete, but it is the most complete that I could put together, focusing primarily on the primary US video releases on all available home video formats, from VHS and Betamax to Video 8mm to CED to Laserdisc to DVD to Blu-ray and to finally UHD. So I hope this has been enjoyable and informative. I hope it's made you think about maybe releases you've owned in the past of Citizen Kane, or watched the film on in the past, or if you've thought about picking up some of the older releases just for collecting sake, or if you're just a giant fan of the film, or you were interested in any of the older releases. I hope this has been informative about different releases you might want to check out, or you might want to track down and add to your own collection, or see for yourself. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. You wouldn't happen to have a nice cigar, would you?